They laughed when a millionaire adopted a baby who had only 3 months left to live. Not the loud kind of laughter that fills a room, but the quiet, knowing chuckle that people use when they think they've already figured out the ending. But this story, his story, wasn't going to end the way they expected. Before you judge what drives a man to take home a dying child, tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you were him? Because by the time you hear what happened next, your answer might change forever. The letter lay on Ethan Montgomery's desk, like a death sentence written in elegant medical jargon. The mahogany surface gleamed under the dim office light, but his reflection, gaunt, pale, and impossibly tired, looked like that of a man already halfway gone. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Manhattan office, the city burned with life horns blaring people, rushing screens flashing stock prices that once defined his every heartbeat. Tonight they meant nothing. 3 months. That was all the time the specialists at Mount Sinai had given him. 3 months before his heart, damaged beyond surgical repair, would finally give out. Degenerative cardiomyopathy, the letter said, as if Latin could soften the blow of death. Ethan read it again, as though repetition might unlock a loophole, a technical error, a way out. But there wasn't one. There was only the silence that followed when the noise of ambition finally stopped. He poured himself a glass of 30-year-old whiskey, his late wife's favorite bottle opened only once on anniversaries, and raised it in a mock toast to the skyline. Here's to empires, he whispered bitterly, and to men who thought they'd live long enough to enjoy them. The liquor burned going down, but it didn't burn away the hollow ache in his chest. For a moment, he imagined the headlines, "Real estate mogul dies alone at 58. He wondered who would even attend the funeral. His wife, Claire, had passed years ago from cancer. They had no children. His brother lived somewhere in California but hadn't called in a decade. Money had bought him every comfort except someone to share them with. His phone buzzed. Another board meeting reminder. Another deal waiting for his signature. He closed his eyes and pressed dismiss. The empire could run itself now. What mattered was what he didn't know anymore. All he felt was the suffocating loneliness of a man who had everything except purpose. When he finally left the building, the city had turned to rain. Manhattan shimmered under streetlights, each drop a silver streak in the glow. His driver, Henry, opened the door to the sleek black town car. Home, Sir Ethan hesitated. Not yet. Drive. They glided through Fifth Avenue, passing the familiar rhythm of New York's nightlife. As they neared Central Park, the traffic slowed beside St. Grace Children's Hospital. Through the rain-spattered window, Ethan saw her, a small figure, huddled in a wheelchair just beyond the hospital entrance, drenched but motionless. The child's head was bent over a stuffed elephant clutched to her chest, its fabric worn thin from love. She couldn't have been more than 5. "Stop the car," Ethan said sharply. Henry pulled over without question. Ethan stepped out, rain instantly soaking his expensive suit. The chill hit him like punishment, but he walked toward the girl anyway. Up close, he saw her face too pale, too tired, but with eyes that carried an uncanny calm. "Where's your family?" he asked softly. The girl blinked, unsure how to answer. Her voice, when it came, was faint but steady. "They said they'd come back, but they didn't." A nurse burst out of the hospital doors, spotting them. "Oh, thank God," she sighed in relief. "I was looking for her." She slipped outside again. Again, Ethan asked. "She's been here for months," the nurse explained quickly. "No family visits. She has a rare immune disorder, advanced stage. The case is complicated." Ethan crouched beside the girl, rain dripping from his hair. "What's your name, Lily?" she whispered. "Lily Thompson." Her hand was ice cold in his. He didn't know why he said it, perhaps instinct or madness, but the words came before reason could stop them. She shouldn't be out here. I'll take responsibility for her until you find someone. The nurse stared at him, startled. Sir, that's highly irregular. Irregular, he repeated, glancing back at the sleek car waiting under the streetlight. So is dying without ever doing one decent thing. An hour later, the city's gossip blogs exploded. Terminal millionaire adopts dying child he met in the rain. Ethan ignored the noise. Back at his penthouse, he stood by the fireplace as Helen, his longtime housekeeper, wrapped Lily in a soft blanket. The vast apartment, once cold as a museum, seemed to hold its breath. The little girl gazed around wide-eyed at the marble floors, the towering windows, the art worth millions. Then she looked up at Ethan and said simply, "It's too quiet." He had no idea what to do with her. He didn't know how to comfort a child, how to cook a meal, how to talk without sounding like a quarterly report. But when Helen prepared a bowl of soup and Lily's small hands trembled, lifting the spoon, Ethan reached out to steady her. Her touch was feather-light, yet somehow it steadied him more than he steadied her. Later, when Helen tucked Lily into the guest bedroom, its sheets untouched for years, Ethan lingered at the doorway. The girl clutched her stuffed elephant half asleep. "Good night, Mr. Ethan," she murmured. "Good night, Lily," he replied, unsure when anyone had last wished him the same. Back in his study, the letter from the hospital still lay open on his desk. 3 months. The same number Lily's chart had carried at the bottom of her file, hastily copied by the nurse before he left. Estimated survival 3 months. A coincidence? Or maybe fate had a cruel sense of symmetry. As the storm raged outside, Ethan picked up an old copy of Charlotte's Web, a book he hadn't touched since Claire used to read it aloud for charity events. He walked quietly into Lily's room and sat beside her bed. "Want to hear a story?" he asked. Her eyelids fluttered open. "Is it a happy one?" He hesitated. "Maybe not yet," he said, "but it might be." He began to read. His deep, polished voice softened with each page, shedding decades of practiced authority. By the time he reached the line, "You have been my friend," that, in itself, is a tremendous thing. Lily was asleep, breathing slow and even. Ethan closed the book and looked out the window at the city lights. For the first time in years, he didn't feel entirely alone. 2 people, both with 3 months left to live, had found each other in the rain. He didn't yet know that this night, this single reckless act of compassion would unravel everything he thought he knew about life, about legacy, and about love itself. The first morning after Lily arrived, the penthouse felt like an entirely different place. The silence Ethan Montgomery had once considered his refuge was replaced by small living sounds. The squeak of wheelchair wheels, the soft hum of a child talking to herself, the clink of a spoon against porcelain as Helen prepared breakfast. For years, the vast apartment had echoed with the hollow footsteps of one man drifting between board meetings and insomnia. Now, laughter, tentative and fragile, seemed to linger in the air like sunlight through dust. Ethan stood by the kitchen doorway, watching as Lily traced patterns in her oatmeal with the back of her spoon. Her small hand trembled, but her eyes were bright, curious. "Is this where you live all the time?" she asked. "Yes," he said, realizing how absurd the space looked through her eyes. Endless marble floors, glass tables that seemed afraid of fingerprints, a grand piano no one had touched in years. "It's just me here," he added. Lily looked up. "It's too big for just one person." He smiled faintly. "I used to think so too." Helen, who had served Ethan for over 2 decades, approached with gentle amusement. She asked if we have any crayons, sir. Ethan blinked. "Crayons?" "Yes, to draw." Helen said, her voice patient, like one explaining childhood to someone who had forgotten it existed. I told her, "We don't. But perhaps we should." Ethan found himself saying, "Order every color they make." That afternoon, Lily's drawings began to appear everywhere. On the refrigerator taped to the windows, one even discreetly slipped under Ethan's study door. Each one was simple yet strangely powerful. A yellow sun, a crooked house, two stick figures holding hands. The second figure was tall with a gray suit and kind eyes. Underneath, she had written, "My safe place." When Ethan saw it, something in his chest shifted. For the first time since his diagnosis, his heart didn't feel like an enemy. Still, not everyone shared the warmth growing in his home. The following week, the newspapers erupted again. Photos of him pushing Lily's wheelchair through Central Park splashed across headlines. Ethan Montgomery loses grip, adopts dying child amid declining health. His board of directors called an emergency meeting. Margaret Hayes, his aunt and chairwoman, led the charge. She arrived at the penthouse one morning, unannounced, draped in pearls and disapproval. "Ethan," she said, sweeping in like a storm. "We need to talk about appearances." He gestured toward the living room where Lily sat arranging her crayons in color order. "We can talk here." Margaret frowned. "This isn't appropriate. You've turned your home into a hospice. The board is nervous. Investors don't appreciate instability, especially when the CEO is making emotional decisions." Ethan folded his arms. "My health doesn't affect the company's performance, and neither does my decision to care for a child who had no one." "You're not a social worker," Margaret snapped. "You're a businessman." "Maybe that's the problem," he said quietly. "I've been a businessman too long." Margaret glanced at Lily, her gaze sharp and assessing. "What are you really doing, Ethan? Trying to rewrite your legacy before it's too late?" "Maybe," he admitted. "But if that's the case, I'm finally rewriting it into something worth leaving behind." She left in icy silence, heels clicking like the punctuation of a warning. Days passed, and Ethan found himself learning the strange language of parenthood. He woke early to check Lily's medications, remembered to cut her toast into triangles, and discovered that bedtime stories were less about the words and more about the presence. Each night as he read beside her, the lines on his face softened. His once sterile apartment began to feel human again, warm, with the scent of pancakes and crayons, and the soft hum of music. One evening, Helen found Ethan sitting cross-legged on the floor beside Lily, attending a tea party made of plastic cups and invisible tea. "You're supposed to sip," Lily instructed, pointing to his empty cup. He obeyed, solemnly pretending to taste. "Exquisite," he said, and she giggled a sound so pure it startled him. "You don't laugh much," Lily observed after a moment. "I forgot how he admitted. My mommy used to say people who don't laugh forget how to be happy." Ethan looked at her small, serious face. "Your mother sounds very wise." "She was," Lily said softly. "But she got sad when I got sick." That night, when Lily fell asleep, Ethan returned to his study. The folder of her medical records sat on his desk, filled with words he barely understood: rare immune deficiency experimental therapy terminal. Something about it nagged at him. He had built his career on seeing through numbers, detecting patterns others missed. Yet here, the numbers felt wrong. He made a note to call the attending physician the next day. The following morning, Dr. Elena Ruiz arrived at his request. Calm, intelligent, and uncompromising, she reviewed Lily's file in silence. "These reports are inconsistent," she finally said. "Her symptoms don't align with this diagnosis." "What does that mean?" Ethan asked. "It means," she said carefully, "someone might have made an error, or worse, an assumption. I'd like permission to run new tests. Do whatever it takes," Ethan replied. "No limits." While Dr. Ruiz arranged for the evaluations, Ethan tried to maintain a semblance of normal life for Lily. They spent an afternoon on the penthouse balcony watching the sunset paint Manhattan gold. She pointed to the sky. "If I ever get better," she said, "I want to fly in an airplane. I want to see where the clouds sleep." "You'll get better," he told her, though he didn't know if he believed it. "Promise?" she asked. He hesitated, then nodded. "Promise." That night, after putting her to bed, he began writing in a leather-bound notebook, something private, something he hadn't done in decades. On the first page he wrote Project Heartbeat. Below it, a single sentence. "If I can't add years to my life, maybe I can add life to someone else's years." Over the next few weeks, the house continued to transform. Helen added fresh flowers to the hallways. Lily's laughter echoed through the marble rooms. Music drifted from the long, silent piano as Ethan began to learn simple melodies with her. It wasn't perfect. There were nights when fear returned, when his chest tightened painfully when the thought of leaving her alone crushed him. But every morning she was there, smiling, ready to greet another day. Dr. Ruiz called one evening with an update. "Her test results are strange, Mr. Montgomery," she said. "Not alarming, just strange. I'll need more time." Ethan hung up and stared at the skyline. For the first time since his diagnosis, he felt the faint, dangerous spark of hope. It scared him almost as much as dying. As he turned off the lights and walked past Lily's room, he paused at the doorway. She was asleep, her small chest rising and falling with steady rhythm, the stuffed elephant tucked under her arm. On the nightstand beside her bed sat a drawing she'd made that day, him and her standing under a giant heart, smiling. Above it, in uneven handwriting, she had written, "Love fixes broken things." Ethan closed the door gently and whispered into the quiet, "I hope you're right, kiddo. I really do." The autumn wind swept through Manhattan, stirring the leaves that had gathered along the edge of Ethan Montgomery's terrace. He stood there in silence, watching the city pulse with its endless rhythm, while his own heartbeat felt uncertain, irregular, like a metronome that had lost its purpose. It had been 3 months since Lily entered his life, and in those months his world had quietly shifted on its axis. What had once been sterile and predictable now felt alive, unpredictable, human. Yet beneath the laughter and warmth that Lily brought into his home, something darker had begun to stir, a dissonance he could no longer ignore. Dr. Elena Ruiz had called earlier that morning. Her voice carried an unease he hadn't heard before. "Ethan," she said carefully, "the more I look into Lily's medical history, the less sense it makes. Her diagnosis isn't consistent with her current condition. I'd like to meet tonight. There are things you need to see." By the time she arrived at the penthouse, the city was sinking into twilight. Papers spilled from her satchel as she spread them across Ethan's dining table. Charts, lab results, signatures. "These are Lily's hospital files from St. Grace," she explained. "But notice this: different doctors, conflicting test results, dates that don't line up. And look here, every major procedure was billed to a private foundation, the Hayes Medical Trust." Ethan's chest tightened. "Hayes," he said slowly. "Margaret's foundation." Dr. Ruiz nodded. "It's not unusual for a foundation to fund treatments for children, but this isn't philanthropy. These files show selective data alterations. Her lab work was modified to exaggerate her condition. I believe someone wanted her declared terminal." He felt a cold rage rise within him. "You're saying they made her sick on paper? Or at least made her appear sicker than she is," Ruiz said. "There's no active infection, no systemic deterioration that explains the original diagnosis. Someone wanted her case controlled. The implications hit like a storm. His Aunt Margaret, the woman who had chastised him for adopting Lily, had been financing her treatments and falsifying her records. But why? That night, Ethan barely slept. He sat in his study surrounded by Lily's drawings, the bright colors mocking the darkness crawling through his thoughts. At dawn, he made a decision. If Margaret's behind this, he muttered, I'm going to find out why. 2 days later, he collapsed during a board meeting. One moment, he was presenting quarterly figures. The next, the room tilted, the walls spun, and the sound of panicked voices faded into nothing. When he opened his eyes again, hospital lights burned above him. Dr. Ruiz stood at his bedside. Your heart can't keep doing this, she warned. You need rest. But rest was impossible. When Lily came to visit holding her stuffed elephant close, she reached for his hand and whispered, If your heart stops, mine will too. That night, as he lay awake, a nurse entered his room. There's someone asking to see you, she said. She claims to be connected to Lily Thompson. Ethan frowned. Send her in. The woman who stepped through the doorway looked nothing like the desperate parents he'd met in hospital corridors. She carried herself with quiet strength, her eyes a mirror of Lily's, but clouded with years of loss. My name is Grace Bennett, she said. I'm Lily's mother. Ethan's first instinct was disbelief, but something in her tone silenced his doubt. Grace took a seat beside him, clasping her hands tightly. 6 years ago, I was a research assistant at Montgomery Biotech, one of your subsidiary firms, she began. I worked under a grant funded by the Hayes Medical Trust. My team studied rare genetic markers that affected immune response in children. Margaret Hayes was our benefactor, but she demanded results that didn't exist. When I refused to manipulate data, I was fired. Shortly after my daughter got sick. Ethan's pulse hammered in his ears. You're saying my aunt knew about Lily, she more than knew, Grace said. She arranged for Lily's treatments. I didn't realize it at first, but the clinical trials she sponsored were unapproved experiments. When I tried to pull Lily out, Margaret threatened to ruin me, and she did. I lost everything. I left Lily at St. Grace under the belief she'd receive compassionate care. Instead, they isolated her. I tried to get her back, but they wouldn't let me near her. They said she was too ill. When I saw your picture in the news, when I realized you'd taken her, I knew I had to tell you. Ethan stared at her, struggling to make sense of the impossible connections. Why would she do this? What could she possibly gain? Grace hesitated, her voice trembling. You, Ethan. She did it to control you. She knew your diagnosis was coming. I suspect she falsified that too. He froze. My diagnosis, yes, Grace whispered. Margaret needed the board to see you as unstable, dying. If she could position herself as the successor, she'd control everything, your company, the foundation, even the research divisions. And when she learned about Lily's genetic profile, the same marker you carry, she used her as leverage. A perfect story to make you appear irrational. The pieces fit together with devastating clarity. His sudden illness, the manipulated test results, Margaret's obsession with succession, and the girl who had wandered into his life like fate but had been placed there as part of a cruel design. Ethan pressed a trembling hand to his chest. She used a child to destroy me. Grace's eyes filled with tears, and she almost succeeded. When Dr. Ruiz joined them the next morning, she confirmed what Grace suspected. Ethan, I reviewed your own medical records. They were handled by a specialist linked to the Hayes Trust. Some of the results were altered. I believe your condition is serious, but not terminal. With proper treatment, you can live for years. He sat in silence, the revelation washing over him like cold rain. The death sentence that had haunted him for months was built on a lie. Hours later, Ethan returned to the penthouse. Lily was waiting in her wheelchair, coloring by the window. When she saw him, she grinned. You're home. He knelt beside her, taking her tiny hand. I am, he said softly, and I promise I'm not going anywhere. That night, he called Margaret. His voice was calm but edged with steel. We need to talk, he said. Ethan, she replied coolly. You sound unwell. Perhaps you should focus on recovery." He cut her off. "Don't play games. I know about the falsified records. I know about Lily. You wanted control. Well, you're about to lose it." There was silence on the line, then a chilling whisper. "Careful, Ethan. You don't know what you're meddling with." "Oh, I do," he said. "I'm meddling with the truth." When he hung up, the city lights shimmered beyond the glass, and for the first time in months, Ethan Montgomery felt his heart beat with purpose, not from fear, but from fury. The empire he had built was corrupt at its core, and he was ready to burn it down if it meant saving the little girl who had unknowingly saved him first. The snow had just begun to fall over the city when Ethan Montgomery finally made his choice. For months, he had lived under the illusion of dying. His every heartbeat counted like grains of sand slipping through an hourglass. But now, armed with the truth, his life felt fragile for another reason altogether. It mattered again. Every moment, every breath, every chance to make it right. Dr. Elena Ruiz's latest report confirmed what he and Grace Bennett had dared to hope. Lily's condition was not what the hospital had claimed. Her illness, though real, was entirely treatable. The original diagnosis had been twisted, her medical data intentionally altered to fit the narrative Margaret Hayes needed. But the most startling revelation came when Dr. Ruiz looked up from her notes, her expression a mixture of disbelief and awe. "There's something else," she said quietly. "I reran the genetic tests you both authorized. Lily isn't just compatible with your markers, Ethan. She's your biological daughter." The words hit him like an earthquake. For a moment he couldn't speak. "My daughter," he whispered. Grace nodded, tears shining in her eyes. "I wanted to tell you before, but I wasn't sure you'd believe me. It was years ago, before the company took over my research. I never imagined it would come to this." Ethan looked at her memory, slowly knitting together the missing pieces of a life that had felt so detached from meaning. A charity event, a fleeting night, a woman whose laughter had seemed to cut through his grief when nothing else could. He had buried that memory beneath layers of ambition and denial. And now, here she was, the mother of the little girl who had taught him how to feel again. He turned away, gripping the edge of the table. "All this time I thought I was saving her, but she was saving me." Over the following weeks, Ethan's focus shifted entirely. While his lawyers, led by Daniel Ford, began assembling evidence of Margaret's corruption, Ethan poured his time into Lily's recovery. He hired a team of ethical specialists to oversee her treatment under Dr. Ruiz's supervision, sparing no resource to ensure she received the best care possible. The penthouse transformed into a small hospital of light machines, humming softly, flowers brightening every corner, and laughter returning with each passing day. Grace moved in temporarily to help. At first, it was awkward, the unspoken history between them, mingling with the chaos of parenthood, but something deeper began to take shape. They shared quiet nights in the living room, reviewing Lily's progress, planning her future. When exhaustion took hold, Ethan often found Grace asleep in the armchair beside her daughter's bed, her head tilted toward the faint rhythm of Lily's breathing. One evening, as snow gathered on the balcony railings, Ethan sat beside Lily at the piano. Her hands trembled on the keys, but her eyes glowed with concentration. "Press gently," she told him. "If you hit the notes too hard, they break." He smiled. "Is that how it works?" "That's what Dr. Ruiz says about people, too." Lily replied, her tone as solemn as a philosopher. "If you push too hard, they break. But if you're gentle, they grow." The melody that followed was clumsy, uneven, but it filled the room with warmth. For Ethan, it was the sound of something impossible healing. In mid-December, Margaret's schemes finally began to unravel. Daniel Ford presented evidence to the board, financial records, forged medical documents, emails between Margaret and her clinical contacts at St. Grace Children's Hospital. The truth spread like fire. The very empire she'd sought to control now turned against her. She was forced to resign from the Montgomery group, her name synonymous with betrayal. Ethan attended the hearing in person, Lily's small drawing of a heart tucked into his briefcase like armor. When it was over, Margaret met his gaze for the first time in weeks. Her expression held something unexpected, not defiance but regret. "You were never supposed to find out," she murmured. "It wasn't meant to destroy you. It was meant to save the company." "You can rebuild a company," Ethan said quietly. "But you don't get to rebuild a child's life." She didn't respond. As security escorted her out, Ethan felt no triumph, only an ache where anger had lived for too long. That night, back at the penthouse, Grace found him on the terrace, watching the snow drift over the city. "It's over," she said softly. He shook his head. "No, it's beginning." He turned to her, his breath visible in the cold. "We were both broken in different ways. Maybe this is how we start again." Lily's recovery, though slow, defied every expectation. Each day she grew stronger, her laughter returning with a brightness that no medical chart could measure. By spring, she could walk short distances without the wheelchair. The doctors called it remarkable. Dr. Ruiz called it a miracle. Ethan called it love. When the last snow melted, they decided to visit the small beach house in Cape Cod, a place Ethan hadn't set foot in since Claire's death. The ocean stretched endless and blew the salt air sharp with renewal. Lily ran ahead, her laughter carried by the wind. Grace stood beside him, her hair whipped across her face, eyes glistening as she watched their daughter chase the tide. "She's free," Grace whispered. Ethan nodded. "So are we." That night they built a small fire on the sand. Lily sat between them, drawing shapes in the ashes with a stick. "Can we make a wish?" she asked. "Go ahead," Ethan said. She closed her eyes. "I wish people who feel lonely could find each other like we did." Grace looked at him then, and in that silent exchange something unspoken became certain. They had lost too much to waste what was left. As the fire burned low, Lily leaned against Ethan's shoulder, drifting toward sleep. He looked up at the stars, the same ones he'd once feared he'd never see again, and whispered, "You were right, Lily. Love does fix broken things." And in that moment, beneath the vast, forgiving sky, Ethan Montgomery realized that the miracle he had once begged heaven for had already happened. It wasn't the healing of a disease. It was the rebirth of 3 lives that had been waiting all along to find each other. A soft spring wind carried the scent of magnolias through the courtyard of the newly built Montgomery Children's Heart Institute. Sunlight glimmered across the glass facade where the engraved words above the entrance read, "For every heart that refused to give up." Ethan Montgomery stood at the top of the steps, gazing out at the crowd that had gathered for the grand opening. The world saw him as a miracle, a man who had returned from the brink of death to create a legacy of hope. But as he watched Lily skip between the rows of guests, her laughter echoing off the marble walls, he knew the truth. The real miracle wasn't his survival, it was her existence. A year had passed since the night everything changed. The man, who once measured life in profit margins and quarterly projections, now measured it in mornings spent making pancakes, in evenings filled with piano notes and bedtime stories. The illness that had once defined his days had receded under new treatment, his body growing stronger than anyone had dared predict. And yet his heart had been healed long before the doctors confirmed it healed by a 5-year-old child who refused to stop believing in him. When he stepped up to the podium, the applause faded into a hush. His voice carried across the courtyard, quiet but resolute. "A year ago, I thought I had 3 months to live. I thought my story was ending." But sometimes, he said, pausing as his eyes found Lily in the front row, Life gives us second chances in ways we can't understand. I didn't find mine in medicine or wealth. I found it in love. In the small miraculous act of opening my door to someone who needed it more than I did. He spoke of the hospital's mission not as a symbol of his wealth, but as a promise. A place where children like Lily could be treated not as numbers or experiments, but as stories waiting to be rewritten. He shared the stage with Grace Bennett, whose calm, assured presence beside him silenced even the most cynical of his former colleagues. Her tireless work had made the center possible, her scientific brilliance finally recognized after years of injustice. As he looked at her, he saw not the woman from a painful past, but the partner who had walked beside him through every storm since. When it was Lily's turn to speak, she took the microphone with the poise of someone who had lived far beyond her years. They said, "My heart was too weak," she said, her small voice trembling at first. But they were wrong. It just needed love. The audience erupted in applause, many brushing away tears. Ethan turned away for a moment, his throat tightening. He had faced billion-dollar deals and boardroom wars, but nothing had ever moved him like those simple words from his daughter. After the ribbon-cutting ceremony, the crowd began to disperse. Ethan lingered, watching as Lily twirled in her new dress near the reflecting pool. Grace joined him, folding her arms against the soft breeze. "You did it," she said. "No," he replied. "We did it." He hesitated, then added, "And she made us both better people." Grace smiled her gaze, following Lily. "She's our compass. She always points us back to what matters." That evening, they returned to Cape Cod, the place where everything had begun anew. The ocean shimmered under the setting sun, and Lily raced ahead with her hair flying, carrying a folded piece of paper in her hand. "It's my letter to heaven," she announced, "for Grandma Claire." Ethan felt the familiar ache at the mention of his late wife, but it was no longer sharp. It was a soft memory now, one that had made room for joy. Lily knelt at the edge of the water and placed the letter inside a paper boat, setting it gently afloat. "I told her thank you," she whispered, "for sending you to me." Grace slipped her hand into Ethan's. For a while they said nothing, just listened to the waves roll in and out. The light turned gold, then rose, then blue again, as the sky deepened into evening. "Do you ever think about how strange it all was?" Grace asked softly. "How everything had to fall apart just right for this to happen?" Ethan nodded. "I used to think it was chance. Now I think it was mercy." He turned toward her, his expression open, unguarded. "When they told me I had 3 months to live, I started counting down every hour. Now I don't count anymore. I just live." Behind them, Lily called out, "Come see the stars." She pointed to the first one appearing over the horizon. They walked to her side, the three of them standing together as night settled over the ocean. Ethan lifted Lily into his arms, feeling her heartbeat against his chest, strong, steady, alive. "They said we had 3 months," he murmured more to himself than to anyone else. Grace leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder. "And somehow," she said, "we found forever." The tide whispered over their feet, washing away the last traces of the paper boat. Above them, the stars flickered into life one by one, silent witnesses to a story that had ended not in tragedy, but in grace. For the first time in his life, Ethan Montgomery no longer feared the end. He had already lived his miracle. When the story of Ethan Montgomery began, it was about a man who had everything the world could measure, but nothing that truly mattered. He was powerful, respected, wealthy beyond imagination, yet profoundly alone. The letter that told him he had only 3 months to live didn't just diagnose a dying heart, it exposed a life that had forgotten how to feel. What unfolded from that moment was not merely a tale of survival, it was a rebirth, a rediscovery of what it means to be human. Through the rain and the chaos of New York City, fate placed a 5-year-old girl named Lily in his path, a child abandoned, terminally ill, and waiting for a miracle she didn't expect to come from a stranger. When Ethan chose to take her home, he didn't realize he was also taking home the piece of his soul he had been missing. In teaching her how to live with joy in the face of uncertainty, he learned how to love again. In protecting her, he rediscovered courage. In her laughter, he found the music that mended his own broken heart. But love's path was never simple. The revelation that Lily was not just a stranger but his daughter, the very embodiment of a past love and a future he never dared imagine, transformed everything. It forced him to confront the corruption within his own empire, to stand up to the family that had betrayed him, and to redefine legacy not by wealth but by integrity. Together with Grace Bennett, Lily's mother, and his partner in both science and redemption, Ethan built something greater than an empire. He built a home, a truth, and a legacy of compassion that would outlive them all. The Montgomery Children's Heart Institute became the living symbol of that transformation, a place where suffering turned to hope, where second chances were not just medical but emotional. And when Ethan stood before the world, his voice no longer carried the sharp precision of a businessman. It carried the warmth of a man reborn. He had learned that time in its truest form is not measured by months or years, but by moments of connection, kindness, and courage. What began as 3 months to live became a lifetime of purpose. The lesson in Ethan's story reaches far beyond fiction. It reminds us that we all have a 3 months moment, a point when the illusion of control shatters, when life demands that we choose what truly matters. It's easy to get lost in routine, to chase success while neglecting the quiet spaces where love and meaning live. But if we stop long enough to see the people beside us, to open our hearts the way Ethan did, we might find that the miracle we've been waiting for is already within our reach. Compassion has the power to heal not just others, but ourselves. So, as you close this story, take a moment to reflect. Who in your life needs your presence, your forgiveness, your time? The answer to that question could change everything. And if this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that love in all its forms is the only real legacy we leave behind, please take a second to subscribe to this channel. Your support gives us the strength to keep creating stories that inspire hope, courage, and belief in the good that still exists in this world. Because somewhere out there, another story is waiting to heal another heart, and with your help, we'll keep telling them.